Romans 7:9 refers to Paul speaking of him being alive once apart from the law. The question is, does this statement prove the doctrine of total depravity to be incorrect? Let's look at this issue together. It's important to remember to read all of Romans 7 through 12 to understand what is being taught here in this passage. In verse 7, the apostle states that he would not have known sin, that is what it was, except through the law. For he did not know covetousness except the law had been saying to him, you will not covet. But make sure to remember that even apart from the law, Paul states in Romans 1:32 that people are still guilty of committing sin. So make sure we do not make an overstatement. Sin is already being charged people as being guilty of it even before the law, even in Paul's thought. You see here in verse 8 that sin took advantage through the commandment and worked in me all covetousness. For apart from the law, sin is dead. Notice here the apostle states that sin is to be considered a force, not only an action. So within the writings of the New Testament, the notion of sin, contrary to those advocates of the Restoration movement, sin can be both a force and an action. Verse 9, he said, for he was being alive formerly apart from the law, but when the commandment came, notice again, sin sprang to life. That force came to full bear within his being when the commandment showed up. And it is said that he died, and the very commandment which was for life was found in me that it was unto death. For sin took advantage, there it is again, through the commandment and deceived me, and through it caused death. Therefore, the law indeed is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good. So, what Paul is really trying to communicate here is the law puts the full light on what our true nature is. In verse 13, the law magnifies our problem in order that sin might become exceedingly sinful, kathuperbalain, through the commandment. This knowledge of our true nature in verse 14 becomes clear through what's being said. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am, notice the present tense, am fleshly, sold under sin. In verse 17, he states, it is no longer I who works this, but the sin which is indwelling me. Notice this is again, he's referring to this as a force that is working these actions out. And also pay attention to that phrase, no longer I. Let's explore what that really means. The no longer I motif is also seen in Romans 11, verse 16, where it states, if it is by grace, then it is no longer by works. What Paul is saying here is the system of salvation didn't change, but one's perception of that reality is what changes. So he goes on to state in verse 18, for I know that it does not dwell in me, that is, in my flesh, that which is good. So depravity still becomes an issue even after regeneration because our souls are still tied to this fleshly existence that still needs to be redeemed. Notice that in the flesh, this negative connotation of this word. And finally, Paul comes to the end of his discussion in verse 24 through 25, even though talking about the negative aspects of what this stark reality brings, he still brings the hope of the gospel, where he says, "O wretched person I am, who will rescue me from this?" Here it is, somatos to thanatu, tutu, this body of death. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So the only hope of achieving the full restoration of the complete man, that bipartite setup of how our nature is done, it begins in our spirit and will eventually work its way out to completely take over our fleshly nature, thus redeeming the whole man. So this is a true example, or a true explanation of what Paul was trying to go for here in this discussion.